Hey everyone. I want to welcome you all to today's open air conversation hosted by me, Dexter Wimberly, and presented by the Harvey Gantt Center. I hope I'm coming through loud and clear, and we're going to begin. I want to welcome Jackie Milad to this month's open air. Jackie Milad is a Baltimore City-based artist whose mixed media abstract paintings and collages address the history and complexities of dispersed cultural heritage and multi-ethnic identity. She has participated in numerous group and solo exhibitions, both nationally and internationally. Select exhibitions include shows at the Harvey B. Gantt Center, Loyola University, Maryland, the Walters Art Museum, Baltimore Museum of Art, and the Luis de Jesus Gallery in Los Angeles, to name a few. Milad is a multi-year recipient of the Individual Artist Grant from Maryland State Arts Council. In 2019, she was named a Janet and Walter Sondheim Prize finalist and a Robert W. Deutsch Foundation Ruby grantee. Recently, Jackie received a Municipal Art Society of Baltimore City Travel Prize to conduct in-depth research on the Egyptian antiquities held at the British Museum and the Petrie Museum in London. Without further ado, I want to welcome Jackie Milad to today's conversation. How are you?
I'm good. Hello. I'm excited to be
So,
here.
um, Yeah, we're excited to have you. I'll start off by saying happy holidays. You know it's the
Same to you.
holidays because I'm wearing this. This is the holiday sweater, the December sweater. Anyway, so I believe I have a bit of a lag on my end, but I'm just gonna power through it. I'm hoping that the timing of my questions is coming through okay. But nevertheless,
Yeah, it's great.
I believe you are coming to us from your studio in Baltimore,
Correct. Yes.
right?
Behind
And
me is a work in progress. Yeah.
sure. So tell us a little bit about being an artist in Baltimore. I mean, I think there's a lot to talk about today, and certainly things I want to catch up with you on regarding your career and specific projects that you're working on. But let's start
Mhm.
with place. Baltimore, like many other cities, I'm sure is undergoing some significant changes. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your experience being a working artist in the city of Baltimore.
Yeah, Baltimore. I grew up in Baltimore. I I don't know. It's just a place that I leave and then I come back to. Um, it has, I think, the kind of support that that all artists I think look for, which is a strong community, supportive. Other artists are very supportive. I find a lot of inspiration from the people that I'm around, and not just artists but creatives. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's a great city, and everyone should visit.
Thanks for sharing that. And
Mhm.
I think the last time I saw you in person was in Charlotte. You were doing a residency at the McCall Center.
Mhm.
I'd love to hear a little bit about that experience, and then I have a few other
Yeah.
questions I'd like to follow up with. But talk a little bit about the time that you spent in Charlotte at the McCall Center.
Yeah, that was a very fruitful experience. McCall Center, I was there in the summer 2021, and when you go into residency, for me anyway, I'm full of ideas of experimentation, things that I want to try out. And the folks at the McCall and just the facility and everything make that possible. So I was really able to come up with some wild idea and then follow through with it. And one of the things that I really started to think a lot about while I was there was like how to really incorporate this idea, or to start doing research around dispersed Egyptian heritage. Um, that was something that had always kind of had at the back of my mind as I was working here in Baltimore. But I think having some time to actually do some reading, listening to podcasts, and having conversations and studio visits with people, chatting with folks in Egypt about this idea, and really taking the time to look at museum practices of acquisition of Egyptian artifacts, and particular the British Museum. And so that's when I really started to look at their online database and use their online database as a mining tool, and to find some objects, draw them out, and then to put them onto my work. I mean, you can kind of see behind me some of these things, but that McCall was where I was able to really start to dive into that more deeply. Yeah, I mean, I did a lot of painting. I did a lot of art making while I was there, but a lot of research and reading happened because I have a child. And so sometimes you don't, it's hard to finish a book when you have a kid.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. It was. Well, it's what's interesting about that. I mean, you've kind of jumped to a point I wanted to talk about at some point during our conversation. I'll kind of save it for a moment and stay on this particular line. But so you mentioned research a lot, and I want to just spend a moment talking a little bit more about how central research is to your art making practice, and to what, and it seems that you're going to some really significant lengths to do research on Egypt, for example, which obviously you have a
mhm.
shared heritage. You can talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that, there's never been a time in my life that I wasn't questioning or asking the question of where do I belong? Who are my people? Like I think that as a child of immigrants, and of two very different cultures, Egypt and Honduras, I grew up in a household that's three languages was spoken really regularly, um, and in Baltimore, right? So I've always been questioning, like, where do I fit? I mean, even as a kid, like, when I was in kindergarten, and I was mixing languages, and the teachers were like, "Oh, she has a learning disability because she doesn't know how to speak proper English." That this was the 70s, so things were different a little bit. But I think that I just was always kind of, seeking out ways to understand. And, even as a child, again, like looking at multitude of pictures of my family, like looking at pictures that like dated back to like the early 1900s, of my relatives in Egypt. And that, I would like, again, like, how does this connect to me? Going to museums as a child, trying to understand, like, how do these ancient objects connect to my heritage and who I am? So this like sort of satiated desire to understand and research and all of that, like that's been going on for a long time. And I
Um, th-
yeah, and I think that it just, for the sake of like bringing it into my work and how it has evolved into the work, it just has always, I mean, I guess it just right now makes the most sense, because I want to create this like world that is mine, right? Like I want to merge all of this information and media into one place, and understanding, the story and the history is so important. It's important to me to get it right. um I don't know if I answered your question, but
you
I
did,
yeah.
you did. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what you've discovered about your own heritage that was surprising to you, both um, I would say on both sides of the coin, on both, the Honduran side and on the, Egyptian side, in the sense that me being an American, let's start with Egypt, for example. And I think the very first time I met you and did a studio visit with you, which was probably at this point maybe 4 years ago, if not 5 years ago, something like that. We had a similar conversation where we were talking about all of the tropes, the Egyptian tropes that Americans tend to think of. It's always about the
Mm-hmm.
pharaoh, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
sort of almost begins and ends with the pyramids.
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
right, but
Mm-hmm.
there's obviously so clearly so much more to every culture than these sort of tropes that somehow make it into our consciousness because of Hollywood and television, what have you. But have there been any dramatic discoveries that you've made about your cultural heritage that may have like reshaped what you thought growing up?
Mm. Yeah, that's a great question. Um,
I'll
I
put it into
think,
another context while you're
yeah,
thinking about it.
sure, sure, sure.
Like for example, a lot of Black Americans, African Americans like myself, um, believe we know a lot more about Africa than we do until we actually visit. And then we realize, wait a second, what we thought we knew and what's real, two entirely different things.
Mm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think that I would say, like, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, as a child going to museums, I was, really honestly searching for a connection between the people that I knew at home and, like my relatives in, um, the relatives that I was around. I wanted to know, how do we relate to this ancient culture? Because the way that it's presented in museums is that these objects are, they don't belong to the modern Egyptian, that it is like a, it belongs to humanity, right? And which is, obviously true and on some level, but
Right.
there is this like, how does this object in the museum, how does it connect, like truly connect to the modern day Egypt and culture and traditions? And and I feel like I'm still learning that. And I think the one thing that I do know, that I did learn, in my reading and research and thinking about this stuff more recently, is that the museums are getting it all wrong. The way that they present these ancient objects out of context, right? Like, without giving information about modern Egyptians and a modern culture, they're really missing out on the timeline. They're like not giving the full picture. And so, it's not my fault that I couldn't figure it out, going to a museum. It's in, it's the museum that's not giving the full story. Um, and that, I think, I would say, as far as Egypt is concerned, it is, as you know, like, it is like such a, like, like, researched, heavily researched, especially ancient Egypt, um, place, nation, culture, and so I feel like that there's just this like abyss of information, like I can't, like I'll never be able to really fully get to. On Honduras, on the other hand, is there's almost like a lack of information, you know, and that, I think, that's harder. Like, even on a personal level, like, my father's family had all these photographs, and sort of like, this is the history of our family. But then on my mother's side, they're they were very poor, and my mother grew up on a volcanic island, and off the coast of mainland Honduras. And there were very rare pictures. There's very little documentation, right? And so, I think kind of thinking about these two places and how diverse those two places are, like ethnically, culturally, and just, yeah, I think that the more it's sort of like the onion issue, the more that you kind of pull it apart, the more that there is to learn, and you realize like how little you know. But yeah, I mean, I feel like whenever I go to um, when I've the times that I've gone to Egypt, because I'm not fluent in Arabic, barely fluent at all. um, but or going to Honduras, it's very obvious that I am American. So I don't know. It's a really, yeah. There's so much. I mean, the things that I've researched, and something that really surprised me, that I learned about recently, was this very upsetting practice, where the Western archaeologists would go to Egypt, and there was this practice of digging up mummified human remains, um, and using them for the most bizarre purposes, right? Not just for the show of the, like this, like, look what I found, treasure hunting, but like all of these like nefarious purposes that, that I think I had no idea. Not that I don't want to go into that too much, but I think the sort of the problematic practices of how objects were taken from Africa and from Egypt, like that has been, um, that to me has kind of, there's been an awakening of understanding all of that, um, and just, um, again, like just how little I know about it. Um,
Right.
so yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, you've shared a lot, and there's a few things I wanted to come back to. I mean, there's certainly been a lot of discussions lately about repatriation and objects that were, I mean, to be frank, stolen, being returned to their proper places, and there's a lot of resistance, as well, that I'm sure you've either read or seen, where certain scholars feel like the places that these objects were taken from don't really know how to care for them, so it's better that they remain in the hands of the people that took them, which is layered
Hmm.
with all sorts of colonialism and racism and
Hmm.
all sorts of other problems, that
Yeah.
need to be dealt with. And I think your work is interesting in the way that you are, in some regards, also sort of like excavating certain aspects of culture, and bringing them forth in your work. Museums get a lot of things wrong. They get some things right. They get a lot of things wrong. And I think that anyone who's grown up going to museums probably had that experience. In our generation, you and I, look, we're not same age, but relatively close. Anyone in our generation, I think we would go to museums and they were just these venerable places where you felt like if it was written on the wall, then it must be true.
Right.
Like,
Yep.
like there's like, like how can it not be? How can it not be true? Um,
Yeah.
and what's bizarre to me is that even from a purely scientific standpoint, there were things like, this is different, but dinosaur fossils, for example, that were reassembled completely wrong, for
Mhm.
and were on
Mhm.
display for decades until they realized, wait a second, that's not right. And so you have an entire generation of people that thinks that this animal looked a certain way when it looked completely different, potentially different in reality, and you can amplify that through so many other aspects. That's just like a metaphor for
Mhm.
for like what
Totally.
museums are, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so, I think that's another thing about your work that I find to be, very, very exciting. So we have the benefit of having some images of your work, and I want to start the slideshow
Yeah.
so that we can talk more specifically about the way you make your work, and then also some specific finished pieces. So we'll start here with this. I guess we'll call it in situ studio shot, which looks like there's works in progress, and you always seem to have a lot of
Yeah.
work on the floor. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, yeah, these are pieces that I gosh, when was this? Um, Over the summer, I guess. Um,
Hmm.
that I eventually cut up. So I cut the canvas to create these shapes, but so this is at the very beginning stage. So you're seeing two different points of working. So the piece that's predominantly white, I don't know if it's like on your right or left on the screen, but the one that's predominantly white, that one is still kind of building up the layers. I do a lot of just sort of mark making, and but the one on the other side, it's layered up a little bit more. Not quite finished still, but history is really important to what I'm doing. So you have a chance to see, and when we go through these images, you'll see closer. But when one is looking at this my work, you're seeing the history of my hand. So you're seeing layers and layers of work that was cut up and reused and collaged in, that may have been made 10, 15 years ago, along with new marks that I've created. So again, this sort of like building up of my own personal world, and telling my own history, I think that's definitely key. But yeah, so that's just, and the stuff on the floor, that's the cut up stuff. Yeah, so I have a practice of um, regularly kind of assessing and reassessing my work, and repurposing. And so I will, you know, create a piece, cut it up perhaps, and use it in a new piece, and cut that and use it in a new piece, so that there is this like never, um, that the work, I often say the work is paused versus the work is finished. And so that there's always kind of like this life to it.
Oh, that's an interesting concept, pause as opposed to finish. I don't think I've heard, I think I've heard people express that in different ways, but not in those words. I like the use of the word pause. Um, I'm going to steal that. So,
Okay, do it.
um, let's advance to the next image. I remember when I visited your studio for the first time in Baltimore, and I noticed some writing on some of your work that didn't appear to be your own, and I believe it was your son who had um, you
Yeah,
sort of collaborating. Is that an ongoing
yeah.
thing? Are you still allowing and introducing your son's hand into the work?
Yeah, oh, definitely. I mean, he's 11 now, so you know, his interest is waning, I would say. I mean, he's very much still an artist, and he takes his practice very seriously. But yeah, I would say that when he comes into the studio, and he's been coming into working on my work since he was 3 years old. Um, but when he comes into the studio, he is very much an active and a collaborator that I take very seriously. And so he'll pick up mark making tools and just kind of go at it. And yes, at times there are moments where I have to, kind of let go of control and accept the collaboration, his contribution, even if it's like over something that I thought was really great. you know. But he's no, but and truthfully, like he's such um, a smart artist, and I take his contribution seriously. Yeah.
Well, I think it's wonderful that you embrace that, and and I know that there are a lot of other artists who are maybe watching this, or maybe will watch it in the future, who are parents and trying to figure out whether the studio space is a quote unquote sacred space that you don't allow anyone in and you just kind of work in, or whether allowing your child, or in some cases children, to have some access to your process in art making to just see what happens, just to
Mhm.
see
Mhm.
what happens. You never know what's going to happen. It could be a disastrous outcome, of course, that's always possible.
Totally. Yeah.
But you never know until you try, right? Um,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
yeah, yeah. So I have another question about the shapes of your canvases and the fact that I don't think I've ever, I could be wrong here, but I don't think I've ever seen your work stretched traditionally on stretcher bars. Like, I don't think
No.
I have. And why
No,
not?
I mean,
Why did you
I
decide
yeah.
not to do that?
Yeah, so when I want to say that like shortly before we had first met, I was still working exclusively on paper, and I really love the way that paper kind of takes a shape, as you're adding medium and materials to it, and whether that's paint or collaging, that it starts to move off the wall and warps and does all of its has a mind of its own. And so the materiality I was just really attracted to, but I really wanted
Hmm.
to have and I was just talking about them to a friend who is a really, very wonderful fiber artist, and I was just talking about all of the work as the on paper. I kept talking about it as tapestries. I was like, these tapestries, et cetera, et cetera. And she was like, well, why don't you just use, textile to you keep talking about them as tapestries. And so that is, I guess that, was mind blowing. Those moments where it's like, oh yeah, that's really obvious. Um, can be sometimes really mind blowing. So anyway, that's part of it, was that I just wanted to create these works that, read as tapestries, or sort of these objects of storytelling, um, in the same way that a tapestry would be used back in the day in castles or whatever. But I wanted the canvas to also have the texture of it's kind of hard to see in these images, but the texture of the wrinkling and the muddling of, after I've dyed the canvas. So all of the canvas here that you see, that's sort of a beige color, is dyed with tea. But really, you see this sort of almost like a tie-dye effect, right? Like this texture. And so that was like a part of the work. And yeah, I also I want them to feel like, wait, was this dug up? Did you dig this up somewhere?
Hmm.
Like I want them to
Right,
have
right,
that
right,
kind of feeling of antiquity. Um,
right.
yeah.
Like a
And
patina,
and
basically,
the
a
colors and
patina
the
and aging.
yeah, yes, exactly. Yeah. Mhm.
Let's
Yeah.
advance to the next image, and perhaps this may be a work that so this is a finished work, and so can you talk a little bit about the materials in this work? So obviously there's the tea dye, let's call it the tea dyed canvas, which is the base
Mhm.
substrate, and then
Mhm.
how are you
Yeah.
building this up?
Yeah. So I I always kind of go at it in a really with my canvases, I go into sort of like, um, don't hold me back, like I just start like either spraying paint at it, or I just kind of attack the canvas and the surface, because I know it's just going to get covered up. I might write some thoughts on the canvas. I will just lots of texture paint mostly. And so there's a lot of patterning. In this particular one, I used white paint because I never use white paint. Um,
Mm,
and I was like, oh, I want it to have this sort of like, um, I don't know, like a little bit of a glow to it. And so I decided to start with kind of a tinted, it's a tinted, uh, almost like a very, very light pink, but mostly white. Um, and so, yeah, I start out with just like lots of play, actually,
right.
and then listening to a lot of music, and which is very important to me, and then just kind of like over the course of weeks and a lot of time, I'm adding the cut pieces from previous works, or I'm collaging other material, found material, and then going in and painting over that. I'm also, something I was going to show you. It's like show and tell,
Sure.
but I also print. So I draw, those objects that I find at the British Museum, in particular these days. But I, will find those objects, draw them, and then put them into a digital form, and then I put them onto chiffon, which is this material, chiffon, and
I
then
see.
this
Hmm.
chiffon gets gets collaged on top of the work. And so I'm really trying to really integrate these ancient objects into my story. Maybe this a little literal, but like I'm really trying to make a relationship with these objects. And yeah, and so it's a lot of going back, leaving it, coming back, and yeah, it's
I
wild in
mean,
here.
one, one could interpret this as abstraction, but there seems to be a bit of, I see this, and maybe it's the two eyes and the placement of those two eyes that kind of anthropomorphizes this work, and it feels a bit more like a portrait than some of your other works. I don't know if that was intentional or if it's just my interpretation, but there seems to be something here that reminds me of a human head, and of course all of these things are open to interpretation. And just before we go to the next slide, could you talk a bit about the title of this work?
Yeah, payaso is clown in Spanish, and so you're right. Actually, almost all of my large works are portraits, or I see them as portraits. Sometimes there's eyes, sometimes there's not. Like but I do think of them as in that kind of structure. Um,
Hmm.
and but I think that in terms of titles, I had an older work that I cut up, and it's almost like an ode to this older work. But I cut up the older work, and I had written payaso on this older work, and I cut it up, and I just really I regretted cutting it up. And I was like, "Oh, like, I really love that piece. Why did I do that?" But I added it to this, and I was like, "Well, this is, an ode to that work." But it
Excellent.
also,
Excellent.
um, I think that it's, um, you know, sometimes the titles are, a way of confronting something, or, I have a thought, or I'm thinking about, maybe politics, for example, or some article that I've read or whatever. And kind of it's sort of an internal conversation that I'm having. For like, what would
Hmm.
I say to
Hmm.
that person if I could? Um, but
Hmm.
yeah, that's,
Let's advance to the next slide, and I want to we'll continue to talk about the work, but I also want to talk about some other things. So before we talk about this work, you've had quite an interesting past couple of years. I included you in a group exhibition that I curated at Soko Gallery, which sort of like seems like a lifetime ago. Time is just sort of completely malleable these days. I have no idea when anything occurred anymore, but nevertheless, uh,
yeah,
it feels like that was 2 years ago. I think that's about right. Um,
2021. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, feels like about right. And a lot has happened for you since then. My camera is frozen. I'm hoping you can still see me and hear me, but I'll keep going.
Yeah, you're good. Mhm.
Okay. Um, so a lot's happened since then. Can you talk a little bit about some of the interesting things that have been going on with your career? So, for example, I know you're working with a couple of galleries. You've done some art fairs. Can we talk a little bit about some of the activities that you've been involved in the past couple of years with your career?
Yeah. Yeah. So that show with Soko Gallery, that was the summer, um, or spring, right before the summer that I spent at McCall Center, which lined up very
Hmm.
nicely. Um, and since then, I've been working with the Soko Gallery team, which I adore, and I feel very lucky to be working with them. And we in September for Armory, I was excited to have a solo booth with them, so I was able to show my work in sort of a new context. I think for me, anyway. Previously, I had worked like in booths with other artists, but this was a chance to really just show my story, or talk about my work, and so that was very exciting. Um, and right now, I have the work actually behind me, and it's kind of like taking up my whole studio. Is work that I'm preparing for commission at the Baltimore Museum of Art, and I'm super excited about that project that opens at the end of April, April 26th. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just been, it's like, I feel like, uh, you know, at this point in my life, I'm working so much in my studio and spending so much time, you know, not only doing the work of making art, but also doing a lot of work of like the administrative side of being an artist, which I don't think that people talk about very often, which is, it takes time to nurture relationships and communication. And so, yeah, I feel like it's been, it's been a wild ride, but I feel like it's been hard work also. um,
Yeah, yeah, no, and no, absolutely. Let's advance to the next image. We're at the final 20-minute mark. This time goes by so quickly. So, I want
oh
to talk
yeah.
a little bit about what's on the screen. This is a bit different than the works we've seen up until now. Is this on paper?
It's on paper. This is a piece that, yeah, I actually collaborated with my nephew and my niece on this one, and Piero, my son. And so it was a group effort. But yeah, this is, what, 30 inches by, it's a lot smaller too. And so I usually do works on paper. This is like a regular, this size and everything. This is like very quick for me. And it doesn't, it's a chance for me to experiment with um, patterning and layers and symbols and things of that nature, so that when I go to the larger works, I have some references. But I also use these works. So the works on paper I often cut up too to add to um, pieces. But yeah, so I've like developed a nice collection of these works on
Thank you for
paper.
sharing
I'm
that.
looking at a bunch
Let's
right now.
advance to let's advance to the next image, and I want to actually come back to something you said about this is a detail of that work. So we'll move to the next image. Again, I'm just being conscious of time. I want to talk about something you said about the sort of like administrative side of being an artist, and for artists who are tuning in today or tuning into the future, in the future rather. How's that balancing act been for you? I mean, as I mentioned, you've worked with more than one gallery. You're doing all of these projects. I don't know if you have a studio assistant or not, but I do know you're a parent. So, like having this kind of schedule and also having the home life or what have you. How's it been balancing that, all of that?
I think calendars are really important in this kind of lifestyle. Yeah, I think that it's there are days where it's really quite straightforward, and I think whenever I start a new schedule, or it's always like a learning curve of like how to balance, when things if there's like a shift. But once I get on this rhythm, I feel very yeah, I feel it's a very kind of a freeing thing. I think the one thing, when you have children, that you learn to be very resourceful and to not take for granted any available time. And so, like if I have, and being a parent now is getting easier, but when Piero was much younger, like if I had like, he was in a nap, I learned to like try to make as much as possible in an hour's time, make the most of it. So I think that I'm just like very aware of like the economy of time and how to really stretch it out as much as possible, but also to like take naps and go like exercise, which I should do more of course, but incorporate dancing while I'm making art, like um, I think yeah, that's um, it's definitely hard, but it's doable.
Right, right. Well, I'm glad you shared that. I think these conversations always it's always important to sort of interject a bit of sort of practicality and like real like life, like life lessons that people can kind of take away who might be in a similar situation,
Totally.
just figuring like how to balance it all.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have have four, I have 4 kids, and I can definitely see when I mention that to people, they're like,
Um,
how does the world even function? And I go, yeah, that's a great question. So, so
it's-
let's advance to the next image, and then and then after we look at a couple more images, we're gonna do a very quick sort of studio walkthrough, and it'll obviously be you moving your camera around, just kind of taking us through your space. But
yeah.
this work here seems quite complex, and if you would just take a few seconds, it doesn't have to be that lengthy. Just tell us a little bit about this work. That'd be great.
Yeah, so what you're seeing, the substrate is actually a blanket that once belonged to my Aunt Amira, and the blanket it was a bedspread, and she passed away in 2014 to complications of breast cancer, and I inherited this blanket, or maybe I just took it from her house, because I was so I don't know, I guess um, there's just sort of an attraction to the idea that this is something that she was sleeping with, and So I used it. I used it on my bed, and slowly the thing started to come apart, and you can kind of see it in the lower corner. Um, and just realized like this can't be used anymore as a bedspread. Um, so I brought it into the studio and hung it on the wall, and just I put sort of a sealer on it, like a gel medium on it, and just to sort of preserve it. And I hung it on the wall. It stayed there for a while, and then I just started to add layers. Daughter of Tefnut and Nut. This is based on um, ancient Egyptian story of the sky and the earth, and the goddess of the sky and the god of earth coming together, and the sort of birth and rebirth of the sun every day. And this story is just so beautiful to me, and so it made me think of like, okay, this is this sort of warrior person, but also protector, that is my aunt. And so that is so it's a very personal piece. Um, and full of layers. I wish that everyone could come and see this in person, because there's lots to see.
Thank you for sharing that. Let's advance
Yep.
to the next image. Um, so this is an oddly shaped work, and not seemingly kind of both typical and atypical,
Yeah.
in terms of the way you.
Yeah.
So you're cutting the canvases and also collaging the canvases. Is that correct, or is this a single canvas?
This was a single, so that top piece is connected to the circular piece. So when it was paint, you can kind of tell, but it was a square, and then I cut out just portion of it to create the sort of rounded circular area. But that's all connected. And then I've like sewn. There's a lot of sewing of other materials on it. Uh, yeah, it's also quite built up. Um, and the way that this is, I think it's for me, I really was thinking of, this is from a series. My name Milad in Arabic means birth, and so that's what the title is. And I was just thinking of these like round shapes as a sort of like, again, like a reference to birth, but also. Uh, like really just sort of a talisman, or
Mm.
like an
Hmm.
evil eye or something like that, or protection. So yeah, that's what that series is about.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Mhm.
I think we have maybe two more images if my memory serves me correct. We'll advance to the next. I also remember getting a catalog from you some years ago. It was a small group show, small in terms of the number of artists. It was you and Ellen Natsui, and who else was in that show?
Oh yeah, Sherry Mendelson and
Right, right,
Alison Sarr.
right.
Yeah,
And I was
yeah, I have that
right.
catalog somewhere.
And yeah, I was looking for it before today's open
This
air,
is the
but oh,
catalog.
there it is. It's behind me. It's behind me somewhere.
It's just right
It's behind
here.
me somewhere. Um, and so in that vein, and then we'll just use your work more or less as like, background for our conversation at this point. So in that vein, and we can actually advance to the next image. I believe there's another. Um, are there artists who you would love to show with? Like if you could just, take your pick of artists that have been influential to you, that if you could show with them tomorrow, or any artists come to
Oh
mind.
my
You can think about it if
gosh.
you but give me one or two. Give me one or two artists that have, and they can be living, or not. But if you could just say, I'm going to have a group show tomorrow with these two artists, and again, it can be in your top 10,
Huh.
doesn't have to be your top two, but who comes to mind?
Oh my goodness.
like a game show. You got 20 seconds.
Yeah, that's really hard, Dexter. I just there's so many artists that I just really adore, obsessed with, really. Um, I just recently, um, I have to say that this is not going to satisfy you. I already know this, but um, I would love to show my work in the context of, antiquities. And so like, having, you know, having my work in the same room with, ancient objects, ancient Egyptian objects or ancient Mayan or what have you, would be an incredible experience for me. And then that is how I get out of saying what artist I want to show
So,
it.
okay, I know I put you on the spot. I know I put you on the spot. So let's stop the slideshow and let's take a moment, and let's do this little studio tour so we can see a little bit of your.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So I wish that, all right, it would be good to see. I'm gonna hold on one second. Okay, there we go. So yeah, so this is a work that I'm working on right now. I'm not going to show you the whole thing because, you know, I want it to be a surprise. But these are some of the details. I've started to incorporate. Can you see? I've stared to incorporate some of
Yes.
these, brass
Okay,
pieces, um,
that's
and
great.
my father is a goldsmith. That's how,
Huh,
we were able to
interesting.
collaborate on these. Um, anyway, yeah, and some other works, some framed works from previous shows. Studio is. I'm gonna take you this way. There's some paintings here. I work really big. um,
Are you working on multiple works at the same time?
I am. So I have, actually, I'm just gonna show you really quick. So I'm working on that big piece, this one,
Mm-hmm.
and then this one here. Sorry, I'm trying my best to like be a good dolly, but I'm terrible at
No, it's working out fine. It's working out fine.
that.
Uh,
Yeah,
I don't have vertigo
I
yet. I think I'm okay.
okay, good, good. Um, So I'll just show you something really quick. Like all of these circular shapes on the pink. This is
Mm-hmm.
all Piero's mark making. These are
Ah.
he told me, see, he did all of that, and he was very insistent that I do not paint over those marks, and so I will not. However, it's like I'm starting to like inch into it, so I'm gonna pause and not do that anymore. Um, these are, and I'll just show you really quickly because I know we're running out of time. But um, this this right here, can you see that? Like the little faces?
Yes.
Is that
Yes.
this read?
Yeah.
So this is a work I did. This is a part of a larger drawing that I did in 2009. And the pieces I've cut up since, of course, and added them to a lot of work. And so because there's so much of it, it's these little heads. The series is in pretty much everything that I've been making. Um, but the history again, like just to kind of give you a sense of like what I'm what I'm talking about when I'm saying
Mm-hmm.
there's a history of my marks, um, like cut up works and those sorts of things. And then this is really quickly. I'll just show you my pile of stuff. See the pile of stuff? That is the pile of Many lots of chiffon, digital drawings, and that sort of thing. So there you
Oh,
go.
that's wonderful. That's wonderful. So I'm going to allow you to get back to your desk, and I have a couple more questions before we conclude today. But I want to say,
Sure. Yeah, of
it's it's really great that you're so generous with showing your space and showing the materials you use.
course.
Not every artist is willing to do that, and I'm really happy that you are. Some artists want to just make it seem like it's just made by magical elves in the middle of the
Magical.
night.
It's totally not. Not here.
Yeah, yeah. I think showing the labor is important, um, and not just purely from a commercial standpoint of showing the value of the work because of the quote unquote amount of work that's
Mhm.
gone into it. I mean, that's a part of it for
Mhm.
sure. But I'm always thinking about artists who are trying to solve problems. And I think sometimes seeing how other artists have solved problems helps them. Um, how to organize your space, how to think about working on multiple works at the same time, how to think about time management, how to think about working serially versus working on one piece for 2 months, all sorts of things that I'm sure different artists working in various mediums have to grapple with. But nevertheless, we've come to the end of our conversation, Jackie, and I'm really, happy that you welcomed us into your space, that you were willing to be so generous with your time. I know we're knocking on the holidays. Whatever holidays people celebrate or don't celebrate, it's still that time of the year where everyone's sort of rushing to get things
Mhm.
done before no one's responding to your emails or phone calls.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank you. I really admire your work. I admire you as a person. I've been
Thank
keeping an eye
you.
on your journey over these past few years, and I'm excited about what's next for you. And maybe there's an opportunity in the future that we may be able to collaborate on something. And I think your idea about showing your work alongside antiquities, I can see that happening. I
Mhm.
think that's in the cards for you.
Thank you.
Um,
I hope
I can see it.
so.
I well,
Yeah.
you can make it happen.
Yeah, I'm working on it. I'm getting there. I have a good friend who's she's become a really good friend. She's a Egyptologist who's Egyptian Egyptologist who's based in Cairo. So we've been having
Oh,
conversations. So yes, thank you so
yep.
much for your support and for having me in this conversation because yeah, it's been fun.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to move on to our final words now. The Gantt Center's goal is always to provide programs that inform and inspire. The support of viewers like you allows the Gantt Center to expand its reach and further develop programs like today's Open Air. To learn more about the ways you can support the Gantt Center, please visit their website. It's ganttcenter.org/donate. It's the end of the year, so it's a great time to make a donation, by the way. Also, be sure to click the subscribe button below the screen if you're watching on YouTube and stay updated on all future virtual programs. Also, follow the Gantt Center on social media so that you can stay up to date on any new announcements. We're looking forward to 2023. I want to wish everyone a safe and happy evening and a wonderful holiday season. We'll see you in January. Take care.